The wind howled like a living thing that night, sharp, cold, and merciless. Snow fell in thick sheets across the lonely stretch of Montana highway, burying everything in sight under a cruel white silence. On the outskirts of town, a small weather-beaten diner stood as the only sign of life for miles. Its neon sign flickered weakly, Maya's place inside. A tired black single mother named Maya wiped down the counter, humming softly to keep herself awake. It had been a hard winter, and business was slower than ever. Still, she refused to close early. Something inside her always told her, stay open. You never know who might need you. That night, need came roaring through the storm. Around midnight, the sound of engines shattered the quiet. Maya looked up to see headlights cutting through the snow. 1, 2, then dozens of motorcycles struggling to reach the diner. When the doors burst open, the freezing wind swept in, along with 25 rough-looking bikers. Their leather jackets soaked, faces pale from the cold. They weren't local, that much was clear. The patches on their backs read Hell's Angels. Most people would have locked the doors, called the police, or at least kept their distance. But not Maya. She saw the shivering men before her, teeth chattering, fingers stiff from frostbite. And without hesitation, she said, y'all come in. Sit down. Let me make you something warm. They hesitated, unsure if they were welcome, but the kindness in her eyes cut through their pride. Soon the smell of hot soup and coffee filled the air, and the sound of laughter slowly replaced the storm's roar. She gave them everything she had, blankets from her own house, hot meals meant for her and her son, and a roof over their heads till morning. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, but the bikers sat in silence, humbled. Their leader, a grizzled man with tattoos on his neck, simply said, "Ma'am, we won't forget this." Then they rode off into the frost-tipped sunrise. Maya thought that was the end of it, but the next morning, as she was refilling the coffee pot, the ground began to rumble again. The sound grew louder, deeper, like thunder rolling in from every direction. When she stepped outside, her heart nearly stopped. Stretching down the entire highway were over 1,500 Hell's Angels, engines roaring in unison, leather glinting under the pale winter sun. They weren't there for trouble. They were there for her. The night had fallen heavy across the Montana plains, swallowing the last traces of daylight in an endless sweep of gray. Snow came down in violent waves, slapping against the windows of a lonely roadside diner that sat like a flickering ember in a sea of cold. Inside, the smell of old coffee and fried bacon lingered in the air. A small radio hummed faintly in the background, its signal breaking in and out with the wind. Behind the counter stood Maya, a woman in her early 30s, her eyes tired but steady, her hands moving in a rhythm born from long hours and quiet strength. She was a single mother, working every night to keep her little diner alive, to keep the lights on in the small home behind it, where her young son slept under blankets patched from years of wear. The world hadn't given her much, but what it had taken, she learned to live without. The storm outside had been raging for hours. The highway was deserted, not a single car passing since sundown. Maya's hand moved absently as she refilled the sugar containers, her thoughts wandering to her son and the heating bill she'd been putting off for a week. Every creak in the diner made her glance up at the door, hoping for a customer, but none came. Still, she didn't close. She never did. There was a strange instinct that told her to keep the diner open no matter how bad the weather got. Her late mother used to say, "Kindness keeps doors open longer than business ever will." Those words stayed with her through every lonely night shift and every storm. As the clock neared midnight, the wind grew fierce enough to shake the windows. Then, faintly at first, came a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was a low rumble, almost like thunder, but steady, mechanical, growing louder by the second. Maya straightened up, her heart quickening. She stepped toward the window and peered through the frost, her breath fogging the glass. At first, she saw only shadows and beams of light cutting through the snow. Then, the realization hit her: motorcycles, dozens of them, crawling through the storm like a convoy of ghosts. Within minutes, the rumble turned into chaos as the bikes pulled up to her diner. Their riders were bundled in thick jackets, faces hidden beneath helmets, engines sputtering and coughing in the freezing air. Maya could see the patches on their backs, even through the frost-winged skulls, and the unmistakable words, Hell's Angels. Her heart skipped a beat. Everyone had heard the stories, the reputation, the headlines, the warnings whispered in small towns. A gang like that showing up in the middle of nowhere usually meant trouble. For a moment, she considered locking the door, but something deep inside her overruled the fear. When the first man pushed through the door, a blast of icy wind followed him. He was tall, rough-looking, his beard crusted with snow. Behind him came more, about 24 in total, shaking off the cold, stamping their boots, their breath heavy in the air. They looked exhausted, their eyes red from windburn, hands trembling from the cold. The leader, a grizzled man with weathered skin and tattoos snaking up his neck, gave Maya a cautious nod. "Ma'am, we don't mean no trouble," he said, his voice gravelly from years of smoke and road. "Our bikes broke down a few miles back. We just need to warm up a bit." Maya didn't hesitate. "You all sit down," she said softly, motioning toward the booths. "Coffee's hot. I'll get you something to eat." The men exchanged uncertain glances. They weren't used to kindness from strangers, especially not from someone who clearly recognized who they were. But the warmth in her voice broke through their tension. One by one, they took off their jackets and gloves, steam rising from their clothes as they sat down. Maya moved quickly, pouring coffee, ladling soup, and pulling leftover cornbread from the oven. The diner came alive with the clinking of cups and the hum of gratitude that didn't need words. Her son, woken by the noise, peeked out from the kitchen doorway, his small face curious. Maya smiled gently and motioned for him to stay back, but the leader noticed him. "That your boy?" he asked. Maya nodded. "He's a lucky kid," the man said quietly. "You're braver than most people we've met." The night stretched on as the storm raged outside. The bikers thawed out slowly, sipping coffee and eating like they hadn't had a warm meal in days. Maya talked to them like they were old friends, asking where they were headed, listening to their stories about long roads, lost brothers, and the loneliness of living behind handlebars. For the first time in a long while, the diner wasn't empty. It was alive with laughter and conversation, and even though it was well past midnight, Maya didn't feel tired when one of the men noticed her thin sweater and the flickering lights. He muttered, "You run this place alone." Maya nodded, shrugging it off. "It's not much," she said, "but it's home." Another biker, younger and missing 2 fingers, spoke up. "You didn't have to help us, you know? Most folks slam the door when they see our jackets." Maya gave a small smile. "Cold doesn't care who you are. Warmth shouldn't either." Those words seemed to settle into the air, heavy and quiet. Even the roughest among them stopped for a moment, as if trying to remember the last time someone treated them like more than a headline. They stayed until the storm began to fade, resting in the booths, some even falling asleep with their arms folded on the tables. Maya kept the coffee flowing, wrapping extra blankets around anyone shivering too hard. Around dawn, the snow stopped, leaving the world outside covered in a pale blanket of stillness. The men stirred awake, their faces softer now, humbled. They had come to the diner as strangers, but they were leaving with something heavier than gratitude. As they geared up and prepared their bikes, the leader walked up to Maya, reaching into his jacket for his wallet. She shook her head firmly. "No charge," she said. "You needed help. That's all." He stared at her for a long moment, then slipped his wallet back and said quietly, "We won't forget this, ma'am." She watched as they rode away one by one, engines echoing against the empty hills, until the last one disappeared down the road. The diner felt strangely quiet afterward, almost too quiet. Maya stood by the window, her reflection faint against the rising sun, unaware that her simple act of kindness that night would ripple farther than she could ever imagine, setting in motion a chain of events that would bring the world to her doorstep in a way she could never have predicted. The morning after the storm, the world outside Maya's diner lay still and silent beneath a thick sheet of white. The snow sparkled like powdered glass under the pale light of dawn, and the air hung heavy with the kind of peace that only comes after chaos. Inside, the diner was warm, filled with the faint scent of coffee and wood smoke. The 25 bikers who had taken refuge through the night were stirring awake, their leather jackets stiff from the cold but their faces softened by sleep and something unfamiliar, gratitude. Maya moved quietly among them, refilling coffee cups, her every motion calm, almost maternal. The night's tension had melted away, with the frost on the windows, leaving behind only the gentle hum of the heater and the low murmur of voices sharing the comfort of being alive. The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man everyone called Bear, stood by the window, watching the sunrise with distant eyes. His beard was flecked with gray, his knuckles scarred from a lifetime of hard roads and harder choices. He had seen the inside of bars and the wrong side of the law, but what struck him most that morning wasn't his past. It was the woman who had opened her door to him without a second thought. "You really didn't have to do all this," he said, his voice low but full of sincerity. Maya smiled faintly, still stirring the pot of oatmeal on the stove. "Maybe not," she replied, "but I couldn't let anyone freeze out there. Doesn't matter who you are. Cold doesn't play favorites." Her words lingered in the air, and the men exchanged glances, some awkward, some thoughtful. They weren't used to kindness without strings attached. The world had taught them to expect suspicion, fear, or anger wherever they went. To be offered warmth, food, and trust from a stranger and a woman alone with a child was something they hadn't experienced in years. One of the younger bikers, nicknamed Trigger, looked down at the bowl of hot soup Maya had served him hours earlier. He'd grown up on the streets, never knowing his mother. Something about the way Maya spoke reminded him of what he'd always imagined a mother's voice might sound like, steady, gentle, and unafraid. Bear finally turned away from the window and walked over to Maya. "You got a good heart, ma'am," he said quietly. "Too good for the world we live in." Maya glanced up, her eyes kind but steady. "The world's only as cold as we let it be," she said. "I just keep my corner warm." He didn't respond, but he nodded slowly, his throat tight with unspoken emotion. Outside, the bikers began checking their motorcycles, brushing off snow and testing engines. The storm had nearly destroyed a few of the bikes, but they were men used to fixing things that were broken. Maya's son, Caleb, now fully awake and bundled in his oversized sweater, watched them from the doorway with wide eyes. The leader noticed him and gave him a small wave, the kind that carried respect rather than intimidation. "Your boy's brave," he said to Maya, his voice soft. "Didn't flinch a bit last night." Maya smiled. "He's got a good heart, too. Learned it from watching." As they prepared to leave, Maya packed up what little she could spare, a thermos of coffee, a few slices of bread, and a bag of apples. The bikers tried to refuse, but she insisted. "Take it," she said, handing the bag to one of them. "You've got a long ride ahead." The man stared at her for a moment, then took it with quiet gratitude. No one was used to someone giving without asking, especially someone who had so little herself. Bear walked back into the diner one last time before leaving. He looked around the small space, the faded booths, the worn linoleum floors, the tiny counter stacked with mismatched cups. Everything about it was humble, but there was life in it, a warmth that money couldn't buy. "This place," he said slowly. "It's special." Maya just laughed softly. "It's small and old," she said, "but it's home." Bear reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small patch, the Hells Angels insignia, and placed it gently on the counter. "You ever need us," he said, "you show this to anyone wearing this symbol. They'll know who you are. They'll know what you did." Maya looked down at the patch, then back up at him, her brow furrowed. "I don't need anything from you," she said honestly. "You already gave me good company on a quiet night." Bear's jaw tightened slightly. "Maybe not today," he said, "but one day, ma'am. You'll see." He tipped his head respectfully, then turned and walked out into the cold. The engines roared to life one by one, the sound echoing across the snow-draped plains like distant thunder. Caleb pressed his face to the window, watching in awe as the motorcycles rolled out in formation, their red taillights disappearing into the horizon. The diner felt emptier once they were gone. Maya cleaned up the tables, collecting empty mugs and napkins, and smiled to herself. There was something strangely comforting about the quiet that followed. She didn't expect to see them again. In her mind, it was just one of those nights life throws at you, a strange twist of fate that brings strangers together, for a few hours before sending them back into the world. But for the men who left her diner that morning, it wasn't something they could forget. As they rode down the frozen highway, the wind biting through their jackets, a heavy silence settled over the group. They weren't thinking about the miles ahead or the next stop. They were thinking about the woman who hadn't flinched at the sight of them, who had offered warmth when everyone else turned them away. Bear's hands tightened on the handlebars as the memory of her smile flickered in his mind. He'd spent a lifetime surrounded by distrust and violence, but what Maya had shown him was something he hadn't felt in decades: faith in people. That night, as they camped miles away under a bridge, a fire crackling weakly between them, the men talked quietly about her. Trigger said, "I don't think I ever met anyone like her." Another, called Diesel, nodded slowly. "She didn't ask who we were or what we did. She just saw people." The firelight flickered across their faces, rough and tired but strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, there was no talk of rides or fights or revenge, only of a woman who made them feel human again. Bear sat apart from the group, staring into the flames. He wasn't a man easily moved, but something in him had shifted. He knew how people looked at them: outlaws, criminals, misfits. But to Maya, they were just cold men who needed shelter. It made him think about the choices he'd made, the paths he'd taken. He didn't speak, but in the quiet of that night, he made a silent promise to himself that her kindness would not go unpaid. Back at the diner, Maya tucked Caleb into bed and looked out the window at the empty road. The snow had stopped falling, and the world was still again. She felt an odd calm settle over her, as if the storm had washed something clean in her heart. She didn't know where those men were headed or what lives they would return to, but she hoped, in some small way, she had reminded them that there was still goodness left in the world. The sun rose quietly over the Montana hills the next morning, its pale light spilling across the snow like liquid gold. Inside Maya's diner, the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the crackle of bacon on the griddle. It was another ordinary morning in her quiet life, or so she thought. She was humming softly to herself, her son Caleb sitting at the counter, eating cereal, the radio playing an old blues tune that faded in and out with static. The memory of the bikers still lingered faintly in her mind, the sound of their laughter, the way they'd thanked her before leaving, and the patch their leader had left behind on the counter. It sat there now beside the register, a small piece of leather with a winged skull embroidered in red. She hadn't touched it since. Every time she looked at it, she felt something strange, not fear, but a quiet sense of wonder at what had happened. Outside, the world was still and white. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind clear skies and a silence so deep that even the hum of the heater seemed loud. Maya thought about driving into town for supplies, but her gut told her to wait. Something about the air felt different that morning, heavy, expectant. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and stared out at the empty stretch of road that cut through the snow like a scar. That was when she felt it, a faint tremor in the ground beneath her feet. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then the cups on the counter began to rattle. Caleb looked up wide-eyed, his spoon frozen halfway to his mouth. The low rumble grew louder, deeper, like distant thunder, rolling closer with every second. Maya stood up slowly, heart pounding, and stepped toward the door. When she opened it, the cold air rushed in, and with it came a sound that made her chest tighten. engines, dozens of them, then hundreds. The roar grew so powerful it seemed to shake the very walls of the diner. From beyond the bend in the road, they appeared an endless line of motorcycles stretching farther than her eyes could see. Black leather, chrome, roaring engines gleaming under the morning sun. There weren't just 25 this time. There were hundreds, maybe thousands. The sound was deafening, but it wasn't threatening. It was organized, powerful, alive. Maya stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes from the glare of the sun as the first of the riders came into view. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the patches on their backs, the same emblem as the one on her counter. Hell's Angels. They filled the highway, 2 by 2, engines idling in unison, the sound of 1,000 heartbeats made of metal and fire. Then, as if on cue, the front line of riders slowed to a stop right outside her diner. At the center of them was Bear, the same man she had sheltered days before, now flanked by riders from every direction. He swung off his bike, snow crunching beneath his boots, and walked toward her with a look that was impossible to read. Part pride, part emotion, part awe. Maya stood frozen, her heart racing. As Caleb peeked out from behind her apron, Bear stopped a few feet from her, removing his helmet. His breath misted in the cold air, and his voice came out low but steady. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Told you we wouldn't forget." Behind him, the other riders dismounted, filling the parking lot and the stretch of road as far as the eye could see. The sound of their engines finally died, replaced by silence so thick it seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, the only thing Maya could hear was the soft creak of snow under their boots as they began unloading things from their bikes. Crates, toolboxes, boxes of supplies. She blinked, confused. Aspar nodded toward his men. "You helped us when no one else would," he said. "Now we're here to help you." Before Maya could respond, the bikers spread out, working in quiet, practiced coordination. Some began shoveling the snow from her driveway and the road leading up to her diner. Others started unloading lumber and repair equipment. Within minutes, her small diner, which had always leaned slightly to one side from years of wear, became the center of a whirlwind of activity. They patched the roof, fixed her broken sign, replaced the flickering lights, and repaired the worn-out heater that had struggled all winter. Another group stacked wood neatly by her porch, while 2 more repaired the broken fence that had been falling apart for months. Maya stood there speechless, tears welling up in her eyes as she watched. No one had ever done anything like this for her before. Her whole life had been about giving to customers, giving to her son, giving to strangers. But to receive, to be the one cared for, was a feeling she didn't know how to process. Caleb ran outside to help one of the bikers carry a crate of canned food inside, his small hands eager and bright with excitement. The men treated him like family, joking with him, teaching him how to hammer nails properly, calling him little man with grins on their faces. Bear walked up beside her quietly, watching his men work. "We passed the word," he said after a long pause. "Every charter, every state, when they heard what you did, they wanted to be part of this. Some rode all night just to get here." Maya turned to look at him, her voice barely a whisper. "All of this, for me?" He shook his head. "For what you reminded us of," he said, "that not everyone out there hates us. That kindness still means something." Hours passed, and the transformation continued. What was once an old weary diner slowly became something shining, alive, and full of warmth. A group of bikers repainted her sign, Maya's Place, in bold, fresh colors. Others built a sturdy new porch and reinforced her roof. Someone even installed a new coffee machine inside, one of the men saying, "You can't be the heart of the highway without good coffee." When they finished, Bear gathered everyone together in front of the diner. The air was filled with the faint sound of engines idling, waiting to roar back to life. He turned to Maya and handed her a small metal plaque, engraved with words that made her throat tighten. "In honor of kindness, without judgment, Maya's Place, the home of the angels." She looked at it, unable to speak, her hands trembling slightly as she took it. The men around her cheered, raising their fists, the sound echoing across the snow-covered plain. Caleb clapped beside her, his face glowing with pride and wonder. Bear stepped closer, his eyes soft. "If you ever need us, for anything, you don't call the police, you don't call the town. You call us." He pointed to the patch she still kept behind the counter. "That's your family now." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. The gratitude on her face said it all. One by one, the riders climbed back onto their bikes. Engines roared to life again, hundreds of them thundering in unison. The sound filled the valley, shaking the ground beneath her feet. As they began to roll out, Bear turned one last time, gave her a nod, and said with a small smile, "You gave us warmth when we had none. We're just giving a little back." Then he pulled down his helmet and joined the sea of riders heading back down the highway. Maya and Caleb stood on the porch, watching as the endless wave of Hell's Angels disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind the hum of engines fading into silence, the scent of gasoline and snow, and a diner that now gleamed brighter than it ever had before. The patch still sat on the counter, and beside it, the new plaque caught the sunlight, reflecting it across the room like a promise that kindness, even in the unlikeliest of places, never goes unnoticed.